started then on what's new in 2022. And the first individual I'd like to introduce is Tom Sides. Tom, you're a partner. Hopefully I do you justice. You're a partner at Dentons. You were chair of the National Technology Transactions Law Society, or law group, and I understand you're a former board member of the Canadian IT Law Association. And your practice these days focuses on technology, intellectual property, privacy, and related commercial matters. So my question for you, and just bear in mind the audience and the discussion we're going is for those who have some role in governance of IT. We have some members of boards, IT managers, directors, and business leaders. You know, the law is a bit of an evolving, living thing. So what are some changes that have happened in relatively recently or that are coming that audience should know about around technology or data security, privacy law?
Sure. Thanks, Devin, and appreciate the introduction. You got it all correct, so good start. Thank you.
Well done.
Yes, indeed. So listen, I might just take us back a little bit before I get right to the present, but I'll just sort of start a ways back and sort of move right quickly to 2022. So in terms of Canada's own history with privacy legislation, it started, I guess you could say, back in the year 2000. It was a Canadian Standards Association code, which was voluntary, that companies could comply with. But obviously it was the establishment of some best practices at the time. And as we know in our world, with technology becoming very prevalent, that has led to, of course, rapid and continual and many complex flows of data, not just within a company and an intranet, but through the intranet, and so throughout and around the globe. So that has really been the impetus for why privacy legislation and data security legislation, they're tied together, really, because a breach of data security means a loss of privacy. So that's kind of the background in terms of it. Fast forwarding to today, now the European Union, as probably everyone knows, has started off really with probably the most comprehensive gold standard privacy and data security legislation in the world. That might be to the chagrin of many people because it's more difficult to comply with, but nonetheless, because we're an international trading world, it is necessary, and the EU has required it as being necessary, that if you want to conduct business with us and if there's an exchange of personal information, then you must have legislation in your own country that complies with substantially similar requirements to those in the EU. And so Canada has passed that test with respect to its federal privacy legislation. The acronym is PIPEDA. I'll just use that. I mean, it's got a longer name. You probably all know about that. And there's 3 provinces that have private sector legislation: Quebec, Alberta, and BC. And for the most part, folks, I'm going to talk, and I think Calvin and Brendan are going to talk about the private sector. There's also public sector privacy legislation, and I'd have to say they've kind of led the charge in many respects, and it's more the private sector legislation that's caught up. So that's kind of the background. So fast forward to 2018, when the GDPR came into effect, and that's the General Data Privacy Regulation from the EU. And again, as you recall from what I said earlier, it imposes requirements on other countries that want to deal with them and trade. The US has had a problem over many years. There's been many cases that have indicated that the US model, which is not legislation, has not been compliant with legal requirements of the GDPR. So it's been an awkward situation. It's usually done on a contractual basis. I mean, it works, but it's not as clean as what we have as between Canada and the EU. So to answer your question more directly then, Devin, we have in Canada, we have a bill in Quebec. Some of you may not do business in Quebec, but it's very aggressive legislation from a privacy and data security perspective that includes all kinds of GDPR-like provisions. And then Canada itself also had an act. It was a proposed act called the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, Bill 11. It was going to be passed, but then the federal government decided they would have a little election, which we all really enjoyed back in the fall of 2021. So that bill was basically put on the shelf, so to speak, but the government of Canada has said that we're going to see some more legislation. So let me just, if I might, Devin, I don't want to monopolize, but in terms of cyber incident reporting, Bill 64, and then also I'll just call it the CPPA, which is the Bill 11, the proposed Canadian legislation, there were a lot of changes with respect to cybersecurity. First of all, there would be a new definition of a confidentiality incident in Quebec. Instead of a breach of security safeguards, you might say that's semantics, but there is a lot of more in-depth requirements for companies in terms of what's a confidentiality incident. They're having to be reported to the Quebec authorities. There's a new risk of serious injury standard instead of the risk of significant harm, which exists in other legislation. And more importantly, there's some really significant fines that should get everyone's attention. The fines for non-compliance can be up to $25 million or 4% of worldwide revenue for non-compliance. If that sounds familiar, it's taken from the GDPR. So again, you can see this imprint of the gold standard legislation around the world impacting Canadian legislation. So that is really significant. And then in Canada, in terms of the CPPA, same kinds of offenses. If there's it goes even higher. Lower in one capacity is $10 million, 3% of global revenue in the financial year before the one in which the penalty is imposed. And if you knowingly contravene a breach reporting provision, then the individual's directors usually could be guilty of an indictable offense, going to jail.
So just pause on that point, because I don't want to gloss it. That just piqued me. Could you repeat that sentence? You could be guilty of an indictable offense if you're responsible for the governance of this matter.
Yeah, it's if you knowingly. It's a higher legal standard, Devin. Sure. It's a good question, right? It means basically that you knew exactly what all the requirements were and you decided to not comply with them. So it would take a high legal test to indicate that you are guilty of that standard. So in that case, it's 25 million and 5% of your gross revenues. So again, it's a criminal offense in that case, right? So there's other changes as well, but I might just stop because I can jump in later. There's many other changes being proposed.
Okay.
But those are the main ones with respect to cybersecurity and breaches, and then the fines associated with non-compliance, Devin.
So, and I notice, when you watch the news all the time about COVID, they always get a follow-up question. So I hope you don't mind if I ask a real quick follow-up question. I think about, maybe you're on the board of directors, you're responsible in some way for, a small or mid-sized business, which is a lot of the audience that F12 supports. And you think, well, of course, they're going after the Amazons and the Googles of the world and the Walmarts of the world, but how much, what should the average SME in Canada look out for to make sure that they're not caught in the crosshairs of these legislation? They're doing things that they reasonably should. I know it's a huge question, but how seriously should they take this? Might be a simpler way to put it.
Well, it's a fair question, and there's no doubt that the bigger companies that are in the crosshairs, as you put it, the regulators or the courts, are the ones that we hear about. Whether it's whether it's Amazon, the Bank of Montreal, it's huge in terms of reputation, as we all know, in terms of being the crosser. So they're kind of the whipping boys and girls, if you will, for the regulators in terms of the cases, the Privacy Commission decisions that are written up about what to do, what not to do. And this all sounds very confounding, and it is complex. It's getting more complex in terms of compliance, which means the costs get higher. It used to be, and I guess what kind of bothers me sometimes is that a lot of people, and I get sometimes the cost-benefit analysis, and when I say people, sorry, I should be more specific, corporations take a light approach. Oh, we have a privacy officer. Oh, who may not know anything about privacy or data security. Oh, we have a privacy policy. They looked at what their competitors have, changed some names, inserted it. They don't have any training, so those create problems, and it's all complaint based. So if you have personal information and you're not protecting that personal information, this gets into the data security side, and Brendan and Kelvin will jump in soon, then of course that leads to a problem. You're going to have a complaint, and it escalates from there. So, it's a dangerous game, Devin, and I know it's expensive, but to comply, and small, medium-sized businesses have to be knowledgeable, and it's getting more complicated, as I indicated, with Bill 64 in Quebec. And the CPPA legislation will come to the fore probably next year in 2023. And it's going to focus on things like artificial intelligence, machine learning,
all these
the right to be forgotten. It's getting complex. So it's, first of all, as you know, it's understanding what are your legal obligations, and then it ratchets down. And I know it's
So
not
it
not for
appears
me.
to me
Yeah,
this is, maybe, and then we'll bring in
yep,
our next panelist in the discussion. But
of course.
from a layperson's perspective, and I'm very much a layperson on this topic, it
Mm.
feels like safety, physical safety legislation and practices, and HR, that they kind of start with the big companies and then practices sort of trickle down and evolve a little bit as the law unfolds and as it as even case law, common law develops and all. And we got to kind of
Yeah.
watch as it happens, and it's not necessarily going to be the same 5 years from now as it is today.
Yeah, I guess in part of maybe I'm not answering your question, but I'll try. I think there's the really important preemptive aspect, right, in terms of finding out what is the law,
Mm.
what are the legal requirements that apply to your business, and of course, if you don't have the resources yourself, then you have to get them. From a criminal law perspective, not this is all about criminal law, but I think people are familiar with that concept that ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Yeah.
And I think in many respects that will be the case with privacy data security. I mean, these ransomware attacks, these data security breaches, they're massive and affecting millions of people. We're talking about billions of dollars in terms of fines and damages to the company. It's really significant. So, in terms of when I talked about the regulatory decisions, case laws, that's after the fact. That's learning what people haven't done correctly, what that they could have done years prior, right, Devin? And regardless of the resources, some of these companies are world beaters, and they're getting exposed for bad
Yeah.
data security standards technologically, but more importantly, more the governance aspects, which I know is a theme that you're wanting to explore with me and
Yeah.
the other panelists.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Tom. Stay right there.
Sure, of course.
And we'll bring up Calvin Engen next to the discussion. So Calvin, for those of you who don't know, he's the CTO of F12.net, which means, and I know this is your passion, Calvin, your number one priority is the security of the 700 businesses and organizations and not-for-profits, et cetera, that we help support from an IT perspective. And of course, F12 overriding that, because a breach of F12 could be detrimental to that entire body. Just for everybody's knowledge, I believe you're the only Canadian member of the WatchGuard Advisory Council, so you help participate in steering, recommendations on that front. And you're a frequent speaker at CEO, Critical Care, CFO, and other forums where business leaders seek to get educated about cybersecurity, data security, etc. So off the record, the non-official bio is Calvin's the guy that I complain about whenever I have to follow any security or privacy rule that F12 has. And then he's the guy I praise whenever our customers or prospective customers ask about those same processes and policies that we have to follow. So that's the context. So Calvin, you've got a broad perspective across at least three or four provinces in Canada about what's happening in the Canadian small and medium enterprise space. So what's been new? What's been happening in the last year or so, and what are the trends into 2022?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I'm seeing without a question still to this day is wire transfer fraud and ransomware being the most prevalent that's occurring in small to medium enterprises. And simply put, the reason why is because it's still making money for the nefarious actors out there. And so the challenge has been is, they're not targeting SMEs. They're just casting a wide net, and they're just drudging up anything they can get, and it's about numbers. It's about volume.
So just in case anybody doesn't know, do you mind quickly defining ransomware and funds transfer fraud?
Sure. So often what we're seeing is this is coming through a phish. So a phish is someone on the other end pretending to be someone they're not and trying to gain access to that person's information. That could be their password. That could be pretending to be someone they're not. And through that, they're getting privileged access. That could be account access. That could be requesting financial information or transferring of financial information, or worse is they now download something that they thought was maybe an invoice or something else, and it's not. And so that's often what we call a ransomware payload. And so that ransomware payload gets installed on a machine, and that begins to look at what's in the organization and then lock everything down and effectively request a payment in order to get access to that data back. So it's the most prevalent. It's the one that hits the news headlines often, and I was just reading a stat the other day, is a quarter of Canadian businesses in 2021 were impacted by a cyber attack. And of those that had ransomware, 46% of them paid.
So almost half. So that's kind of a stunning figure when you think about it. So I think we've all heard of ransomware likely by now, but the notion that almost half of organizations found themselves in a position where they had to pay, they'd rather pay the ransom, which we know just feeds the criminal enterprise that's driving this. Why would an organization choose to pay a ransom? What circumstances are businesses and not-for-profits, governmental organizations to say, what are they finding themselves in that they're opening up the wallet to criminals?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the reason why this is happening is because they do not have a defined incident response plan, and they do not have a defined recovery plan. So often what we can see is that when these attacks happen, they can be dormant inside the organization for multiple months. And so the challenge becomes is, yes, they may drop the ransomware payload, lock everything down, but they've been in the network for maybe 3 or 4 months. And so the challenge is that you'd have to go back a long time in order to do a proper recovery. So that's one aspect. Two.
So I just want to make sure I understand that point. So you're saying they've been embedded in, attacked, or got access to your network for the last 3 or 4 months, say, and you're saying you have to recover back beyond that point in order to make sure they're not there anymore? Because are you saying that you can recover and they're still in because you've recovered their own access? Is that?
Yeah, there's two aspects, right? When you recover the machine, they could still have their agent or whatever they deployed in there so that it's still an infected machine. Or two, what I was going to kind of touch on is that they don't have adequate backups to recover from, or it's going to take too long to recover from. And so it's about the time of which they can be without their data to continue to operate their business. And so many organizations don't know what that really means. And so that's really around, what would be the adequate business recovery time in order to get back from an event, to gain access to the data to still conduct business within their group of clients.
So just to summarize it, then you're saying they may have backups, they may even have usable backups, but the recovery, it's so painful to stand back up business operations. They make a calculus that it's better to just pay the ransom to get a quicker recovery.
Certainly,
So
and usually they've never done a disaster recovery plan test, or they may not even have a disaster recovery plan, worse yet. And so when they actually go back to their backup, sometimes they can't even use it. It's not actually in a usable state. Or two, it's they go back to it and it's like, no, this is not what we need. Or we've recovered the data and they just re-encrypted it right away.
It feels like Back to the Future, because I just remember when I was first in IT services, you go to a business and you'd show them that their tape backup hadn't been running correct. And we're talking about the 90s now, I've got gray hair. The tape backup hadn't been run, or Billy hadn't changed the tape in the last 6 months, and then they go, oh yeah, this stuff needs to be managed. And now folks are, I think, often subscribed to cloud backup services and other things, and then finding they're let down when the rubber hits the road and they need to lever themselves of those solutions.
You would think, but often what we're still seeing is that the ransomware is actually targeting backups as well. And so it will target that backup, encrypt the backup, so you have no way of being able to recover it. And so absolutely, to your point, cloud backups are a must in order to ensure that you have something disconnected, something that can't be infected. The question, though, is that if you have somebody that's been dormant and sitting there, making sure that you're not protected, and maybe inserting something onto those machines so that data is not usable, you may have to have just a longer retention period in order to ensure that those backups are sufficient.
Thanks, Calvin. There's a couple of things I'm going to circle back on with the group about. You mentioned incident response planning and backup, disaster recovery testing, and things like that. So let's pause those. I'm excited to bring up next Brendan Salvo. Great, we've got the four of us here. So stay where you are, Calvin. We'll continue the conversation. So to introduce you, Brendan, you're a director at Blackpoint Cyber, and particularly you're responsible for engagements and relationships with managed service providers like F12. I understand you've been in the cybersecurity space for about 7 years, and the headquarters of Blackpoint is Maryland, but you have a global footprint in terms of helping organizations with their cybersecurity. In particular, you focus on managed detection and response 24/7, those sort of security operations that keep organizations safe. And for everybody's interest, F12 levers Blackpoint. They're a critical pillar in our cybersecurity stack, and for a number of our clients as well. So, and just for a little bit of interesting facts to everybody, if you haven't heard of Blackpoint, encourage you to go to the website and have a look at the history of this organization and why it came about. It's got some founding members and advisory boards who've been on the NSA and part of the. So either Brendan, you're part of the deep state, or I don't know what the whole story there is, but we've got NSA, CIA members. There's a former director of the CIA, General Hayden, that was involved early on. I know was 4-star general. Just a great pedigree of folks who understand the global cybersecurity threat and have made products and services to solve it. So with that, the thing I kind of wanted to pique on my interest, I'll ask the broad question, but Calvin said something I'm going to circle back with you on later. First of all, same question as the others. What are the trends you're seeing from a global perspective, from cybersecurity writ large? What's been happening in 2021 maybe that you see continuing on 2022? What might this audience need to know that they don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing me on, Devin. Happy to be here for everybody. One of the things that we're seeing will really start to accelerate is, to pull the thread of what Calvin was mentioning, in years past, you see the big headlines of large organizations, they have massive attack, it makes, the global news. And really what's shifting is that shift to the small and medium business market, because for these threat actors, which have varying different profiles, you've got the nation states who are essentially operating with unlimited time, resources. They're not operating under any sort of direct control from everybody. They're saying, hey, go take this and go maybe target that large organization, go target an Amazon or AWS. But then you have this whole element of organized crime. Ransomware as a service has been a popularized term, where it's a numbers game for them as well. And so what makes more sense from a business perspective? Am I going to dedicate a lot of time, resources, and effort to go after a large organization who has a lot of time and resources and effort to put into their security posture? Or can I focus my attention to more of the quote unquote run rate business of small and medium businesses in North America, UK, Australia, and target them for something that's going to take me a lot less effort, and I can get maybe a smaller payday, but I can get a lot more quicker paydays done pretty readily. And these organizations are less likely to have the money and resources spent on the layered security approach that everyone recommends is good to have in place. So that's kind of what we've seen shift, again, slowly over the years, but now in these last kind of 2 years, especially with the global pandemic and everyone moving to a remote workforce, that opens up a lot of vulnerabilities to organizations that have now essentially had to take a leap forward and say, okay, well, now we need to operate as a remote workforce and virtualize everything. And that has its own benefits to allow organizations to continue working, but from a security perspective, it also opens up a lot of vulnerabilities for you, for someone to be able to take advantage of that organization. Like Calvin mentioned, a lot of these intrusions come from a phishing attempt. And yes, they do cast a wide net, so they're playing that numbers game. Hey, I might not necessarily be targeting a specific accounting firm. I might be throwing that net onto thousands of accounting firms, and I'm just going to follow the lead of the one that clicked my email, and then I'm going to chase that effort for a quick payday, essentially. And so that's what we're seeing. It's these run rate type of opportunistic threat actors that will go for the low hanging fruit and say, look, we can do a lot more of these a lot more quickly. And really no two scenarios are necessarily the same, because you have different players in the space now as well. I mentioned this kind of ransomware as a service. You're seeing certain roles become specialized as well. You'll have somebody that, operates as a mercenary, and their job is simply to come up with those phishing emails, or find someone who's going to click those emails and get that initial access. And then what they'll do is they'll sell that access off to a group who specializes in
Isn't
actually.
capitalism amazing? So the
I know.
market forces are at work here too, eh?
I know, exactly. And so you see these
Wow.
kind of specialties start to crop up where, they'll hand off that access to, maybe a different group who, they're really good, or they've built their own tool sets at going in, like Calvin mentioned. They're really good at going in and finding where the backups are and compromising those, and then dropping their payload that, comes up with that, flashing skull and crossbones and letter that says, hey, you're going to pay us, this amount of money, or you're not going to get your data back. And that's one of the things that, as I've been with Blackpoint for about 4 years now, we work, again, like you said, with MSPs such as F12. So our relationship becomes, widespread with organizations of all sizes, but, quite a bit of our client base is these small and medium businesses. And a lot of what you hear is, well, hey, these big bad guys, they're not worried about, my data. We're a company of 20 people. And, in order for a ransomware event, for them to be successful and them to complete their objective of getting paid, they need to create leverage over you as an organization. So they don't necessarily care about what's in your data. They might to some extent. You could sell off, credit card numbers and things like that. But really, it's about creating that leverage over you as an organization. So they don't necessarily care about the data, but you care about the data as a business owner. Like Calvin was saying, if you're an organization that relies heavily on your data or your systems to maintain uptime, especially if you're in the logistics industry, where time is of the essence, those types of things become very important to you when all of a sudden you can't access those systems. So that's how these groups are kind of creating that leverage by going in and not only saying, hey, we're going to take your systems offline, but we're also going to do what we call the double extortion event. We're going to compromise your data, we're going to compromise your backups, so that way you can't tell us to go pound sand. We're going to roll to these backups because the backups have been compromised as well. So that's really, kind of a two-pronged change that we're seeing. The bullseye is getting wider. It's covering a larger spread of organizations, and they're turning the screws.
This makes a lot of sense. And you see the market forces. So you can see it's just going to probably get more nasty maybe as things go on. I just imagine, so they're ransoming your data. But why can't they ransom your privacy one day? Like, hey, give us money, or we're going to show these emails to your, the Ashley Madison type play, right?
Right.
I mean, it's privacy is privacy for a reason.
They actually do.
Are good. Yeah, there you go. Okay.
They are. I'm sure many people have seen the email that, hey, we have your password. Here it is.
Yeah.
And we saw that you were doing some some things on your computer that you shouldn't have done, and we're gonna email it to all your contacts. They actually do have a password that has been leaked that's associated with your email address, because there's just a trove of passwords that got leaked, 8 billion passwords. So basically every
Pardon me while I log
there,
into LinkedIn and change mine right now.
8 billion passwords. So
yeah.
You imagine it's like everybody that has a password probably is exposed out there. And so it's easy to kind of, fish that information out of you to say, oh goodness, I better not, I better send something over to them.
Character assassination, even if it's not true, can be effective.
Absolutely.
And maybe especially if it's not true. Fascinating. Brendan, when you're talking about kind of the threats and the small and medium business space, it just tweaked in my head kind of, we watch Ocean's 11 or whatever, and how that sophisticated operation went down. But my risk at home isn't about Danny Ocean, right? They're not tunneling under but my issue is the guy that walks around at night checking whether I locked my car and checking my garage. And yeah, so I lost our bikes because one day I didn't. Like, it can be those fundamental things and those low hits that nevertheless are damaging. Calvin mentioned earlier that I think you said it's 3 or 4 months they might be in your system. And I read once the mean time between detection was something around 170 days. Brendan, is that getting better or worse? The ability for them to get in and go undetected? And then I'll just give you my follow-up question for that already. What do we need to do about that?
Absolutely. So it's getting worse for the average organization because that timeline is getting shorter. And now again, I mentioned every no two situations are necessarily the same. There's a lot of factors that come into play. It depends on the motivation of the adversary. It depends on the hygiene of the organization. Um, because there's a lot of things, we'll kind of get to this a little bit later, but if you're not doing the correct things, you can kind of be a lot more exposed than an organization of a similar size who maybe has a better practice around certain things, using two-factor authentication, not using the same password for everything, things like that. So we are seeing the average timeline certainly decrease. And now some of that is because the targeting is kind of moving from the large, Fortune 100 organizations down to this much broader market of small and medium businesses. So that has a little bit to do with it, but it also has to do with the practices of the adversary. Because again, I can get in and I can get some level of privilege, like Calvin mentioned. Well, those are my keys to the kingdom right there. So if I just want to get a quick payday, I can move around with privilege. We've seen incidents, in as little as several hours, some of them over the course of a few days. And us in the MDR space, our role in the security onion is we're kind of going toe to toe with the adversary as they're on the keys trying to do this discovery and move through the network and try to complete their objective. We're on the other side of that, identifying that this is occurring and then taking subsequent action about that. And so again, it really comes down to a lot of hygienic things on the front end of whether or not you're going to be in a position for the adversary to take advantage of you in a matter of hours and maybe a day or two versus them having to spend days or weeks or sometimes even months essentially banging their head against the wall, checking doorknobs, seeing where they can go in the analogy of your network. So really taking a lot of proactive hygiene and best practices on the front end can really save a lot of time for an organization when it does come to that point where, hey, somebody's in and we need to identify them and respond to them before it turns into hey, all the data's gone and all the machines are encrypted.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was thinking about how quickly they want to get in and out if the payday's small, right? They can spend a year or two if it's a $1 million payload, but if you're going for 20 grand, boom, you're iterating these attacks a lot quicker. On this detection and response bit, the interesting thing is I always just go in my head to a building. So you've got your physical building and you try to secure it and you put, you make sure the doors are locked. You got maybe bars in your window and various things. And then you have the motion detectors. But none of that matters if somebody gets in and there's not a detection and an alert cause and then a response rolling the police or security services or whatever. And I think what surprises is, IT has a huge role in providing that protection and in security, but the detection and response is often where there's not the tools to pick up that it happened. And I'll be vulnerable for everybody here, if you don't mind, my detection and response story that managed detection and response solved us. It was a Friday. I got an email from a client. He said RFP on it. I'm a CMO. I clicked on it. Our contract's not up with them. Yeah, Calvin, he's already embarrassed about this. So I logged into SharePoint. Oh, this RFP isn't about IT services. It wasn't meant for me. Just leave it alone. 30 minutes later, I get a laughing phone call from Calvin saying, hey, you trying to log in from Nigeria? So he knew. Now, fortunately, we have protections. They couldn't get into F12 because we have multi-factor authentication, etc. But wow, like it was that quick and it was that fast and it could have been exposed just like that. And I'm in the business of IT. So I often say to don't ever feel bad. You can get phished. It can happen. It can happen. So
one thing,
go ahead, Calvin, sorry.
I just wanted to just touch on, and yeah, that's a very vulnerable story for Devin, but he often likes to share it. But the one thing that I just want to highlight here is on that managed detection and response, it's not sometimes a phish. Sometimes they've already gone into the network and now they're just lying dormant. They have credentials, nothing's picked up on it. And so now they're inside the network. And it's really now telling to say, what are the techniques that they're using to try to break out, to try to laterally move to different machines, different servers, different computers within the network. And what's important is that that detection that Brendan's team executes against, is hands on keyboard, watching for the events, watching for the techniques that are being ran on the background. That's not what a normal individual would use. You know, they're trying to scan, they're trying to go to servers they normally wouldn't go to, and that's all behavioral analytics that can start to trigger a investigation and an incident. And based on that, they can contain the machine, and they can do that in seconds. In fact, just this last year, we ran a what's called a penetration test. It's basically a validation to ensure that the systems, the processes, the people are all working in tandem. And so we do this at F12 every year, and it's to ensure that, hey, if you don't know where your weaknesses are, how can you fortify? How can you ensure that you're making the right adjustments to ensure that you're protected? And so we do this both externally on our edge of everything that's coming in and out of the organization, as well as we assume that we've been breached. And now we have somebody that's sitting on a computer and they're trying
They're
to break
inside
out
your
of that.
walls. What can they do, basically? Your
Exactly.
walls, yeah. Okay.
And so that this way they can test. I can say, proudly, Blackpoint's team was able to see that there's an attack happening and contain that attack within seconds. It was something that was really, really impressive. It was actually one of the fastest detections and responses we've ever seen from all the partners that we've used in previous years. So I just wanted to make mention of that. That is something that has been really, really great to see.
So Tom, bring it back to the fold here, thinking about, sometimes it's really instructive when you hear a story and that makes you go, well, there, but for the grace of God go I, it can be really instructive. So I know you can't breach confidentiality, but do you have any instructive stories or lessons from the trenches you might want to share with the audience here that, might pique their ears up?
Well, I mean, certainly, in terms of clients, we've had, obviously, around the world, we're a global law firm. We've had clients that have had data security breaches. We've had lots of ransomware attacks on their systems, and we'll often get involved as lawyers, on the front end. And so, I as you said, I can't tell you about those, but I guess one that I think everyone knows about, but I just think it's so instructive if people want to find out what not to do, even with a large company with the resources, is Equifax. I mean, they're in the business of collecting and using, exchanging personal information around the globe, and the type of systems failures and people failures, as Calvin said, and Brandon too, I remember, and Calvin I have presented before, where oftentimes companies will tout their data security technology. It's amazing, and nobody's got better than us. But then the same company will have some rogue, some threat actor come in and have thumb drives and have them in the lunchrooms and all the rest of it, and they insert them into their PC, and voila, they're into the network, right? So wow, so it's all these human processes that often fail. But Equifax is an instructive one because of the volume, the significance, and it's telling for small, medium-sized businesses as well. And I don't think a lot of small, medium-sized businesses would have too much sympathy for an Equifax because of the size of the company, the resources it would have on all fronts to do.
And we didn't ask them to take our data; they just took it. So
yeah, well, right? Yes, that's often the case. Yeah, they're a reviled organization for some. Revile, that probably resonates with Brandon and Kelvin for a certain other reason. Anyway, they can get into that. So it was just in 2017. It's just some stats, though. I mean, it was staggering. There was 147 million Americans that were affected, a lot of Canadians as well, and they got all kinds of information: credit card numbers, driver's license numbers. Any of us that have gone to a bank and you provide that kind of personal information, that's what the Equifaxes have. And so what was telling about it, Devin, again, we want to talk about governance, is the governance processes they had to basically redo within their organization. And they were required by the courts to spend up to $1 billion in terms of revectoring, if you will, their processes and their technology. And they were required to create a fund of $380 million for attorneys' fees. Ours would be like one tiny part of that, but anyway, expenses, service awards, and we're talking about, and it's a good case to read in terms of what not to do. But what they did is they fired a lot of their executives. They reinstituted their procedures in place. They have, I mean, they've really done some current things. I'm just looking at some of my notes in terms of 2020. They basically came up with some continuous improvements, and folks like Brendan and Kelvin be happy to hear about the prominence of a chief information security officer, how important they are. And so this person now is a member of the board, and they look for those credentials now in terms of directors. I mean, obviously they still look for people with accounting backgrounds, legal backgrounds, but this has come to the fore, as we all know. And so these people are becoming very prominent, very much in demand.
So thinking the lesson for the SME is, if I could put it so bluntly, is to get a hold of the governance of this and the continuous improvement aspect before a breach, not after.
Yeah, I agree. And as I said, I guess as a lawyer, sometimes I find that, and I mentioned it before, but it's kind of a theme too. You've got to go deeper than just hitting the surface of these things. It's got to be a deeper dive. And I know it's a tough matter, as I said, a cost-benefit analysis, right? And that's why Equifax is instructive. Bank Montreal, I mean, there's other names one could throw out. They have all these resources, and smaller, medium-sized companies, they're trying to figure out their bets. Where do you put your money, so to speak? So, it is complicated, it is expensive, but there's a lot of information available, a lot of experts, like Brandon's company, et cetera, that are available for people. And so it's no excuse to bury your head in the sand and say, wow, this is really complicated, expensive stuff. That's the world we live in. If you're doing business, electronically in Alberta and Canada and most companies now internationally, it's the price you have to pay, as sad as that is to say, and you can't duck from it because you're a small, medium-sized company.
So you can't duck from it, and it's a complicated, and it's a little bit murky. So I want to turn the lens on. We've talked about the bad actors, but onto our industry itself. So I'm a little bit of an apple cart. One thing I've noticed from a sales and marketing standpoint in the last year is what I would argue are extremely deceptive positionings of products that promise to do something but actually don't. So for example, I ran across this, came from a customer. Well, here was this company does pen testing for like almost free. Pen testing for free. Wow. Well, you read up, and if you're sophisticated enough to understand it, you kind of get down on their website, and you realize they do vulnerability scanning, and not really good vulnerability scanning. They just sort of run almost something you can get for free. Then I imagine people are signing up for this because they call it automated vulnerability testing, which to me is like selling a Roomba and telling you I just got you a janitorial service. Like but how does a business leader know that? And then they go on their insurance form and they go, do you have penetration testing? Yes, I do, because I paid $40 to this company or whatever for pen testing. The terms are being abused. There's murky. There's no regulations in our industry for these standards. Calvin and Brandon, help us. What is the non-IT business leader supposed to make of this this marketplace?
Well, I'll get in here. I think the big thing is that you need a trusted advisor, but it's not to assume anything. And I think the challenge is this is what we're living in. Is they're preying on individuals, business leaders, in order to get money out of them. Now the service is okay, but it's not getting what you actually need. And so this is where it comes back down to ensuring that you have measuring your risk, and measuring your risk through a security assessment. And I'm not just talking to the technology stack. I'm talking about the policies, the procedures, the aspects that often, I was just on a call with a potential client just last week. And part of our security assessment is just to go through the policies, procedures, make sure that they're measuring the tightness of those. The gentleman on the other side said, that's not going to take too long, which indicated that instead of an hour and a half review, it'd probably be 2 minutes because they don't have any. And this is a big company. This is not a small company, 150 users, so they ought to have this. But I think what's important is if you can't understand where you're vulnerable, where you're weak, then you can't then go and put dollars that are going to really make sure that you're protected. And for some organizations, that's not going to be going to the 9th degree of getting all these aspects done. Sometimes you just need to have the basics completed, and you need to have a great security foundation. That security foundation is as simple as making sure that you don't reuse your same passwords, that you have multi-factor authentication, something you have and something you know. Because if you don't have those basics done, you can't layer on all these advanced security features because it's not going to save you. Your weakest link is that barrier, that first barrier of access into the network.
Excellent. I thought I might ask Brendan the same question. The reason why, Brendan, is you provide a managed detection and response, and you've managed to hit Calvin's high bar. And Calvin, for any of you know, he's a demanding individual. And I know, Calvin, you were disappointed in our last MDR and found Blackpoint and have substantially improved our cybersecurity posture. So, Brendan, I mean, in the industry you're in, how do you help MSPs and others distinguish between an MDR that's doing what it says, doing the detection and response and actioning on all these alerts, and others that are selling a service which purports to do the same thing, but in fact doesn't? Oh, sorry, Brendan. Looks like you're muted right now. There you go.
There we go. It was bound to happen at some point. So it's a great question, and it's one of the things. No offense to any marketers out there, but the marketing from the security industry has gone pretty far in making a lot of claims. So if you kind of look around the industry and you go talk to most security companies, they're going to tell you, yeah, we'll solve all your problems. You don't need this, you don't need that. Not important. And so the thing to remember about cybersecurity, of your organization is it's never just going to be a task that you accomplish and you say, cool, we got our cybersecurity done. We don't have to worry about that ever again. It's an ever evolving industry. You're dealing with a human adversary. And if I'm a bad guy who makes a ton of Bitcoin off of ransoming organizations and I hit a wall at some point, well, I'm not just going to give up and say, well, I'm done with that. I'm going to go get a real job. I'm going to continue to work and maybe find another way around it. So all of us on the good side, we have to kind of acknowledge that and say, look, we need that, like Calvin said, that continuous improvement process, sort of always taking stock of where are we, where can we potentially improve. And so in our space, when evaluating, security products or contemporaries, security is never going to be an automated function as well. We've seen that over the years where the initial plan is, all right, well, we're going to put this tool in place. We're going to put this tool in place. We're going to put this tool in place, and they're all going to fire off alarms and alerts, and that's going to stop the bad guys. But if you kind of go to hacking in its essence, it's just circumventing automation at different points. And so that's why we believe it's so important to have that human intelligence element. And Devin, I'm going to steal your analogy. So if you think of your organization's network as a building, and your critical data is in a safe somewhere in that building, and the credentials to that safe are somewhere else in the building, and you have all these protections, locked doors, and you got someone checking badges in the parking lot, you have to operate under the assumption that somebody is going to get into that building that shouldn't. That's the inevitability of the space that we're in, and the way everyone does business nowadays. And now you can put in cameras and motion detectors and a lot of automatic tools to block some things. But you think about the motion detector, well, it's going to learn that people are walking through the building every day because the normal people who should be walking through the building are there. So it's not going to automatically be able to disseminate, hey, is that guy walking through the building someone who's looking to steal all of our information and ransomwares? Or is it just another person who is supposed to be here? So that's really the differentiation. As you're an organization trying to figure out what's right for you. Is there a heavy reliance on my stack of just automation, or is there an element of it where a human is actually going to be making an informed decision about what's going on?
Yeah, excellent. I really, because I think we'd all love it if this was just a technology solution. And the lesson is, it's not just it's a policy, it's a practice, there's a huge human element to it. And yeah, thank you very much for drawing that out. We talked about incident response plan. It came up a few times, and I noted right before this that it's the Cybersecure Canada, federal government agency here in Canada, sometime during COVID released 13 controls, and they develop an incident response plan. This is for small and mid-sized organizations in Canada. It's their recommendations. Incident response plan was number one of those controls. So to everybody here, what and this is an open question, not to any, what is a piece of information or two that those who are listening should take back and start working on an incident response plan for cybersecurity and data security, et cetera? Any recommendations? How do you get started on that if you don't have one already? Or
well, maybe I'll start it off, guys. Just in the sense that you have to look obviously at the jurisdictions you're operating in, right, Devin? Some are going to have prescribed requirements under legislation, so obviously those have to be complied with. Now, best practices, industry standards, etc., can follow that and often support those. And in some jurisdictions, that might be all that you have. But it's going to be important in Alberta and in Canada, Quebec, that you have prescribed requirements in terms of reporting to the regulator, sometimes depending on the impact on individuals, notifying individuals and how you would do that. So it's very prescriptive. So I would say that's got to be an important starting point. So in terms of the details, I defer obviously to Brendan and Kelvin, who could.
So what I'm hearing though is it is an incident response plan. For those of our customers, call F12. Like that might be a component of it, but that is not a wholesome, adequate incident response plan. Okay, Calvin, it sounds like you want to get in here. Yeah,
I do. Just to be mindful of what it takes. It's really about developing a policy. It's about creating a response team. F12 can certainly be a part of that response team, but it has to be individuals within that organization as stakeholders. And so through that, creating a communication plan to the stakeholders. So this is very important. So if you've identified who are those internal and external key stakeholders that should be notified during an event, because that could be suppliers, vendors, or your own customers. And then educate your employees. Go through the test plan. Try it. Find out what's working, what's not working. And what I always encourage is have a war room. When that event's happening, if you don't have a plan, it can be very, in a disarray. And so you want to make sure that you're being very cautious with the information that you're sharing, because too much is not enough, or too much is too much. Not enough won't get you the confidence that you need. And so, because this is all about reputation at the end of the day, is how are you going to be perceived when you now have this event? And then what do you need to do to inform regulators? Whether it's the Privacy Commissioner of Canada or your local provincial commissioner, or both in most cases. So just make sure that you can kind of work through that. And so those would be my items.
Yeah, thanks very much, Calvin. One last question. Don't feel free to answer this or not. We've got some Q&A to go to now, but any one point for anybody who's involved in governance listening, you want them to walk away, if they could walk away from this discussion with one thing that they should take back to their organizations and ask or implement. And I know you're like, you got a list of 100. What might you suggest to everybody who wants to jump in?
So I'll start, and it's I guess it's not one thing, but it's do a SWOT analysis. So any beginner business or management course, you talk about SWOT analysis. What are our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and our threats? Go in and take stock of where you are, not as a business, but as your cybersecurity posture. Hey, what are we doing well? Do we have two-factor authentication turned on? What are our weaknesses? Do we not have two-factor authentication turned on? Are we doing regular vulnerability scans to check what our external landscape looks like? Where's our opportunity to improve? Can we start to develop more of a security focused culture? And then what are our potential threats? What do we look like as a potential target? So one of the things that you mentioned was like, hey, just scan the external, facing pieces of your network, because that's a lot of times what bad guys are going to do. They're going to scan you. They're going to see where the potential pathways in are. So take stock of that and just continuously work towards, improving. So again, just kind of take that stock, identify what you're doing well, what you can do better, and then make a plan to improve upon those.
Thanks, Brendan. Calvin and Tom, anything to add? Don't feel that you need to.
Go ahead, Kelvin.
I was just going to say, you need to measure your risk, because if you're not measuring it, you will not be able to, focus or put the flashlight on the areas that are not. And so just, to carry off of Brendan, it's so vital to understand where those weaknesses are, and everything can fall from there, because you can look at the ones that have the most valuable action, and often I can tell you those items are sometimes inconvenient, but you want to strike a balance between that usability and security. And there is a balance, because at the end of the day, we all use systems and computers to make ourselves more productive. And there's a line where if it's so laborious to get into a machine or conduct business, it's not really making you more efficient. So I'm always very aware of what that means in a business. And so just know that going through and measuring that risk, start with your company's crown jewels. What is the most important aspect of your business? Knowing what that is, because just wrapping your arms around just that aspect can create a lot of awareness and ensure that you're protecting what's most important.
Great advice.
And I would say the legal take on this, Devin, is that directors have under law, they have a responsibility, a duty to act in the best interest of the corporation, to act honestly. And so when they sit around the boardroom table and they're talking about cybersecurity and they're talking about their competitors or other incidents that seem to be happening all the time, ransomware, et cetera, they'll ask themselves, or they should be, what are we doing? Are we going to be taken down? Are we going to be sued in our capacity as a director in terms of what we've done? So it's got to be, again, real what they're putting in place. It can't be kind of a top down, and I'm sure Brendan and Kelvin would see this, where you have the directors say, you shall make this happen, and you say, go away, you scurry away and do some security stuff and come back to us, and then they get a report and say, well, that sounds good, I think we've done everything. It's got to be very layered. It's got to be real. It's got to be reflective of your organization with your customers, and not all companies are the same or in the same industry. So it comes back to the directors, and of course they are not going to want to be held liable in terms of breaching their obligations to the company at law. And so again, they've got to be involved in solving the problem. And one of the things I mentioned, I know Kelvin and Brendan are seeing it too, is to have people with those kinds of credentials advising the board, or actually board members, and then making sure you've got that coordination throughout the organization. And from a legal perspective, negligence does not mean that it has to be absolute. It just means that you have to be doing what is required at law. Of course, there's some legislated matters, of course, that will factor into that, but a lot of it's going to be industry standard. And Brendan Kelvin would have a lot of information in terms of what is the industry standard. So, it could happen. You're going to have a ransomware attack. It could happen. You're going to have a data security breach. And so if you're being worried about being sued by lots of different players in the whole system because their personal information has been exposed, your risk of damage is going to be less. And in fact, it may not be any if you've done those kinds of matters from a governance perspective that speak to what you're supposed to do to guard against a ransomware attack or a cybersecurity attack. Again, recognizing it doesn't have to be foolproof. Shit happens, right? So anyway, that's what I would say. That's my dramatic conclusion.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for giving those actionable things. We've got a couple of questions that came in. I'll throw them out there for anybody who wants to answer them. The first one's about the supply chain attack. That's where you're not directly attacked, but maybe you're now vulnerable because, let's say QuickBooks, the infections in QuickBooks, and now you just got the latest QuickBooks update, or you got a laptop and it was already pre-installed by Lenovo, or whatever the case may be. We saw it even with IT companies through SolarWinds recently, those who followed the news. So how are we to defend against these sorts of vulnerabilities, which seem out of our control? Can we?
So I'll go.
So I'll follow up.
It actually starts with your own policies and procedures. And the reason why I say that is what are the barriers to conducting business with a vendor? Are you reviewing their security policies? Do they have the security policies? And so, part of bringing on any vendor for F12, we go through that rigor to ensure. And if they don't have those components, we don't do business with them. And then if we are conducting business with them, it is an annual review with them on their security posture and policies and procedures, and seeing how they're doing. You can take it another step further, and there is ability to actually monitor them passively, that organization, to see how they're doing relative to that security posture. In fact, the cyber insurance industry is actually doing this. So when you go and get your policy, they actually already have a view of your organization and how well you're performing relative to some of the security aspects. And some
It's just like
people
the
are,
Equifax of cybersecurity. Then
yeah.
there's this, right? Fascinating.
And so this is why people are getting declined, because they actually can see, actually, you're not doing what you say you're doing. So you actually are exposed. You have too much risk. But this is kind of a canary in the coal mine. So certainly that's an aspect that needs to be important. The other aspect is if you are exchanging information between that entity, what are you doing to ensure that that data is protected, especially if it's PII information or otherwise? Because if you're sharing customer lists, you ought to have some protections, additional protections in place. And some people just, fly it over email. It sits in all these unsecure Excel lists and all the rest. And that may be an area that you say, actually, that is the crown jewel to our organization. We ought to put some more parameters around that. We should probably make sure that not everybody in the organization has access to that. So asking those types of questions. I'll turn it over to my colleagues here.
Brendan.
Yeah. So, how do you, to kind of answer the question directly, how do you defend against a supply chain breach? So effectively, you as the, small and medium business, you're not going to be able to help out that supply chain vendor from being targeted. Essentially, it goes back to, if there's a nation state that wants to target a supply chain vendor, they're going to do that, and they're going to dedicate as much time and effort as they want to do that. And then it goes back to what Calvin was mentioning, is making sure your own house is in order. So that way, if something like that does come down, that's completely outside of your control, well, now you've already done the correct things for your own organization to, limit the extent of how you're going to be affected by that. And then going back to all the, governance and policies that Tom was talking about, if things do go sideways, you can show that you have taken every best effort to say, look, we put the controls in place, we followed our policies to the T, we were doing the correct things here. But again, it kind of comes back to some of those basics. So we keep talking about, vulnerabilities and, ways of cleaning those up. It's, think of an analogy of, driving a car. You don't drive a car forever without, changing the oil and getting new brakes and, continuously updating things to a certain extent to make sure that car is still going to running. Same thing for, your IT network. You can't operate under the same technology that you had, even as little as, 3-4 years ago. You need to kind of constantly adjust that, because those are the things that are going to, start to age out. They're going to get end of life or end of supported by the vendor themselves, which means, vulnerabilities are going to come out that can't be fixed on them. So then you're essentially just, walking around with an open wound that's waiting to be to exploited. So doing some of those basic hygienic type of stuff, and it all comes back to kind of that continuous improvement process as well.
So do your due diligence to validate your vendors, but they still might get through. So have your own house in order, make those steps. Really, really good advice. Final question we've got here in the Q&A, and I know it's after time. We still have quite a large portion of our audience still on. Humans are the weak link. What is the personal vulnerabilities of habits other than clicking on phishing actions? What other, human shield activities and habits do we need to inculcate in our staff?
So I'll jump in there with, it's a mix of human and technologies, but one of the biggest things that we always hear pushback from is, we didn't implement two-factor authentication because everyone was kind of annoyed by it. Getting everyone's buy-in on two-factor authentication is probably the, most least effort, most reward for what you can do to prevent things from going sideways. We talked about earlier about how, there's 8 million or 8 billion passwords out there. What you need to operate under the assumption of is, look, if you got a password, it's most likely compromised no matter what, which is why two-factor authentication is just so important. So that way, you have that protection where even if you have a compromised password, you have your two-factor authentication set up, that even if they have your password, it doesn't matter because they can't get that second factor. So getting everyone's buy-in on those types of things, and and kind of encouraging the culture. So encourage people to report what they think might look like a phishing email, getting everyone's kind of buy-in to cultivate that for the organization.
Yeah, I'd add onto that is just having a security mindset embedded into your staff, so that they're asking. It's not just taking anything for face value. It's asking the question, getting verification through another medium, whether that's calling that individual. I got a story where there was a example of a CEO that requested information of a wire of $150,000 to a CFO. CFO said no problem. It was standard business practice. Moved the funds over. About a week later, because they actually were operating in different buildings, CFO was having a meeting with CEO. Just wanted to make sure that transfer went through for you. CEO was like, well, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in that event, they didn't get those funds back. They were already gone. And so it was just as simple as that the domain was an I instead of an L, and that's it. And so they didn't ask the right question, or to go and make sure, hey, just want to make sure, Bob, did you actually want me to send this? That's how easy it is.
And not by that same email, because the criminal will just
No.
reply, yeah, sure, great, love
Yeah.
you. Absolutely, yeah.
This is not a legal interjection, and it's an attempt at humor. I know it's not a funny topic as such, but there was a scenario, and it was I was reminded of it as I listened to Calvin, and maybe him and Brendan are aware of it, where there was a threat actor and an email exchange with some people in the company, and including the CEO. And this email came from the CEO in terms of doing X, Y, and Z. And so one of the people had noticed that that the CEO had said thank you. And this person thought, this guy never says thank you. This guy's an SOB. So honestly, the person was alerted to the fact, I think this is something suspicious, reported someone in IT, and an investigation happened from there. But, someone had asked about the human factor. Well, if that's not human, I don't know what is, in terms of knowing the people, and something that twigs someone to the fact that there could be a rogue actor in your system, so to speak. So I guess the moral of the story is, if you're going to be an ass, then be consistent about being an ass. And anyway.
Be yourself. It's such a cultural element. Hey, much like safety, physical safety, organizations have learned that that's not a one-time, once a year email. It's a continuous effort, and there's a responsibility of every employee, a legal responsibility as well as a moral one, toward safe conduct and not entering into anything that's unsafe. And it's got to be the same thing in cybersecurity, and we're still a long ways away from that culture, I think, in a lot of the Canadian supply chain service sectors, etc. Thank you very much for your participation. To everybody who's been attending, thank you very much. We'd love to hear your feedback. Was this a valuable session? Would you like to see more along the similar lines? We're intent on making sure that we arm you as associates or customers or potential customers or interested parties of F12 with the information you need to keep your organization safe, your reputation, personal and professional, intact. So thank you for your precious time today. And with that, I bid you all adieu.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.